Hi everyone, in this video we'll be looking at how to install a firewall as a virtual machine, and we'll be doing this using Pfsense firewall. And if you don't have the opportunity or the privilege of using a closed source industry established firewall like Cisco, Juniper, etc., Pfsense is a very good option and it has all the features you'd have in any industry established firewall. And this is particularly useful if you'd want to set up a home lab and practice how to use firewall, set firewall rules, and learn more about firewalls in general. So let's get started with Pfsense. So in Pfsense, on the Pfsense site, it says that Pfsense software includes the same features as most expensive commercial firewall solutions. In some cases, Pfsense includes additional features that are not available in commercially closed-sourced solutions. In all cases, Pfsense provides better value for your money. Let us show you what Pfsense can do and get you started on the path to deploying Pfsense software in your environment. So it's a very useful software and you can install it on a hardware, and it has better performance if you install it on the hardware. But in our case, we just want to learn more about how to use it and not necessarily deploy it in a small home or a home office. But if you intend on doing that, it is always advisable to buy hardware. And you can buy hardware directly from the Netgate shop, which basically manages Pfsense software. So I think down here it talks about that. So hardware, if you scroll down, it says that unlike most common commercial firewall offerings, Pfsense project is just a small portion of the firewall. This means you get to tailor the hardware you choose to meet your specific needs. With hardware, you have the option of purchasing a security gateway appliance directly from Netgate. So let's look at what they have available. And I must say, you can also install it on any hardware you want, but you cannot install it on a Raspberry Pi. But there are several other hardware you can install, and you can learn more about this. But in here, let's look at what the Netgate shop has. So you can virtualize it on the cloud. You can also virtualize it using what we'll be doing in VirtualBox hypervisor to create a virtual machine, but it doesn't have the best performance or the optimized performance as you'd have on the cloud or with any of these hardware. So you have Netgate 1100. It's more useful for small offices and branch offices. It only has 1 gigabyte of RAM. It has 8 gigabytes of storage, and it doesn't have so much throughput. We'll compare the types that we have. So let's look at the types. Let's go to pricing and let's scroll down. So this is the Pfsense 1100. And in here, it says that it has layer 3 forwarding of 927 megabits per second. But if you look down, this is Pfsense and Netgate 2100 appliance. It has a throughput of 2.2 gigabits per second. So you realize that this has more throughput. It's faster, but it's also more expensive. This is $349. So if it's just a small home office, you can just go with a Netgate 1100, which is $189. But let's just focus today on how to install this software on a virtual machine like a VirtualBox. So we'll try to mimic an enterprise setting. So we'll have at least 2 virtual machines in our setting or in our setup, and we'll install the Pfsense firewall to manage these virtual machines. And mind you, Pfsense also has, you can also use it as a router. So you can have your one connection connected to the Pfsense appliance and then in turn connected to your LAN. Okay, so let's just quickly look at how the Netgate 1100 looks like. We'll try to mimic this in our virtual setup. So the Netgate 1100, the least expensive, has an interface like this. So you have the one port, which will come from your one connection into this. So as we said, this appliance can also be a router. So you connect your one connection here, and then you connect your LAN to probably a switch, and then all your appliances and all your machines connect from the LAN port using the switch. And you can have an optional network, so you can set up a DMZ. We'll look at a DMZ later on. And you also have a USB connection. So we'll try to mimic this. So we have a one connection coming from a host machine, and we'll have a LAN segment. So let's learn about how to download the Pfsense software and install it on a PC. So let's go back to the home page, and in here we should have a download button. So on the Pfsense Get Started sites, you go to download, and in here you have the source code available because it's an open source software. You have the release notes, but we go to select image to download. So this is the latest version 2.7.0, and the architecture, we're going to be using the 64 bits because you can only install it as a 64 bits. So you choose how you want to install it, either a memory stick installer, but in our case, we want to install it as an ISO installer using VirtualBox. So you click that and you select which server. You can select any of them depending on how close you are to any of these servers, and you click on download, and it should download your setup. Okay, so once you've downloaded the Pfsense setup, you navigate to where exactly it is on your machine. Most likely it will be in your downloads folder. So you navigate there, and you probably should have a file like this. It should be an ISO, or it could be a zipped file where you have to extract it. So you can extract it if you have a file like this. You can extract here, and you should have an ISO file. Okay, so once you extract your Pfsense setup, you should have an ISO file like this. And after this, we go into our VirtualBox, and we will be installing it as a virtual machine. And you can also do this on a VMware workstation player. So let's go into VirtualBox, and we already have two virtual machines. I have a Windows 10, I have an Ubuntu virtual machine as well. So you can at least have one virtual machine in your setup. If you're not familiar with how to install a virtual machine, you can refer to our previous video where we looked at how to install virtual machines using Hyper-V, VMware Workstation Player, and VirtualBox. So in here, you go to New, and you choose the name of your firewall. So let's choose a name, Pfsense VM probably, and we go to the folder that you want the virtual machine to be stored. We'll leave it as default, and then you choose your ISO image. So we navigate to where we have our setup. So once you come to your setup, you mount it, and the next thing you probably will do is select the type of operating system. This is a BSD, free BSD software. So you can just choose BSD. So BSD is a derivation of Unix software, and it's used on several types of appliances. So it's a 64-bit free BSD. So you select that, and then you click next. So the next thing we'll do is to select the minimum type of hardware requirements needed. I think on the Pfsense site, it should give us the minimum requirements. Let's quickly check. Okay, I think it should be in the products. Let's go to the products tab, and let's scroll down. Yes, so the general requirements, it's you should have a CPU of 500 megahertz. It should have a RAM of 512, relatively small RAM, but it's recommended that you should have 1 gigahertz CPU and have 1 gigabyte of RAM, and you should have at least 1 gigabyte storage as well. So I think 1 gig RAM is quite sufficient. So let's set the memory to 1 gigabyte RAM, which it is already, and 1 gigahertz processor. So one CPU should be fine. So you click next, and it says create a virtual hard disk now. So as it said, you should have at least 1 gigabyte of storage. So let's set it to maybe 2 gigabytes of storage. That should be fine. Yes, so you can click next and it will give you a summary. So you have a base memory of 1 gigabyte, you have a disk of 2 gigs, you have one processor, and you can click on finish. So the Pfsense virtual machine will be created on the left side of your screen here. And before we launch it, we want to configure the network settings. So as we said earlier, we'd want to have a setup like this. So we have a one connection. So the connection coming from our router or from our internet access will be connected into the one, and then all PCs will be connected probably to a switch, and then that switch will give internet access to the rest of the PCs in our internal network. So we'll do something similar on the VirtualBox. So we have a one connection coming, and then we'll have all other virtual machines connected to the internal network. That's the LAN. So for now, we probably will just forgo the optional network. We can use that to create a VLAN if we want to, or we can decide to set that up straight away. So we'll have 3 interfaces on the Pfsense appliance or the virtual machine. So that's an advantage of using VirtualBox. It gives you the chance to create several interfaces. So on the you highlight the Pfsense virtual machine, you go to settings, and in settings, you would find network. So in network, you have the opportunity to select 4 different adapters or interfaces on this appliance. So the first one, we would want to make it a bridged adapter. So it will have its own network interface card, and it will use your hosts, wherever your host is taking its internet from, it will use that internet as well. And for the second interface, we would want to have an internal network. So you select internal network and leave it as the name as internet, because we'll use the same name to connect the virtual machines. So this interface will, this appliance will have 3 interfaces. So let's create a third one, an optional network, which will also be internal. So let's leave it as 3 and make sure you check enable network adapter. So we will have 3 cards here. And with the third one, let's change it to internal, the name to internal 2. Yes, so that we distinguish the second interface from the third. So we'll connect to the first using internet, but the third will just be an optional. We can even decide to forgo it right now. So let's disable it just for now. And so we have 2 interfaces, one for the one connection and then one for the LAN connection, just as you would have on this appliance, so WAN and LAN. Okay, so once you do that and then you click OK, and then we are ready to install Pfsense. So double click to start the virtual machine. Okay, so once Pfsense launches, it will start loading the operating system, and we will have a screen where we can go through the wizard. Okay, so once Pfsense loads, you'd be presented with a screen to accept the terms, and so you enter, and it will ask you what you want to do. So we want to install Pfsense, so you choose the first one and enter OK, and key map, the default key map, how you'd want to navigate the screen. So we continue with the default key map, and in here, how you want to partition your disk. We have ZFS, which is used by many appliances. I believe for the hardware appliance, it uses ZFS, but in our case, we probably should go for BIOS, boot method, or UEFI. BIOS is more widely known, so let's choose the BIOS, setup, and click on OK. So it should start installing Pfsense. Okay, so once the installation is done, it will ask you that before exiting the installer, would you like to open a shell? We don't need to, so we choose no. And then it would ask you to reboot the firewall, so you reboot. But whilst it's rebooting, one thing you'd have to do is to remove the mounted setup. So you go to devices, go to optical drives, and then choose remove optical drive. What happens is if you don't remove it, what will happen is it would reboot and then start the setup all over again. Okay, so once Pfsense boots, you should be presented with a screen like this. So this is the Pfsense configuration. So this is how the firewall looks on the Pfsense console. So you'd have the one connection. So it says, welcome to Pfsense 2.6.0. So it's saying that it's a VirtualBox virtual machine, Netgate device ID. So you have the ID there. It's a FreeBSD 64 bits. And so these are the options you have. You can log out using SSH. That's if you're remotely logged in to this firewall. You can assign interfaces. You can set IP addresses. But what we would want to do is we want to use the Webconfigurator. So we will connect using a browser on any of the virtual machines that is networked to this firewall. So before we do that, let's go back to our VirtualBox. And you should, as we said earlier, you should have at least a virtual machine running an operating system such as Windows or Linux on your VirtualBox. So let's go to the Linux Ubuntu virtual machine, and then when you highlight it, go to settings, and then in settings you go to network. So under network, let's make sure that we change the adapter to internal network. So you can select any of them. I'm already running it, that's why only one adapter is changeable. But if your virtual machine is powered off, all the adapters will be you can configure any of them. So make sure you change it to internet. You remember we had the internal network for the firewall being internet, not internet 2. So change it to internet and make sure it is enabled, and then click on OK. So what will happen is now the firewall will be linked to this virtual machine on the internal network. So let's launch the virtual machine, and let's configure the firewall through this virtual machine. So I'm hoping and assuming that the virtual machine, which is Ubuntu, will be given an IP address through the firewall. So we'll check that out. So in here, we first have to enable the internet access, because I think I have disconnected. Yes, so it's wired off. So I have to connect it. So it's on now. So we can open a terminal and check if we have an IP address. So go to terminal and let's type ifconfig. So let's type ifconfig, and yes, so we have an IP address of 192.168.1.100. And let's check our firewall. So our firewall has a WAN address of 172.20.10.4/28, and the WAN network is what is bringing the internet access. But for the LAN, that is where the virtual machines are networked. It's 192.168.1.1. So you realize that the Ubuntu virtual machine is on the same subnet and on the same network as the firewall. So what we'll do is we'll launch our web browser and go to the default gateway, which is 192.168.1.1, to be able to configure the firewall. So let's do that. So let's launch our Firefox. And in our Firefox, in our browser, we'll enter 192.168.1.1. Okay, so in our firewall, let's enter 192.168.1.1. And click on enter. Yes, so you may have a warning so you can click on advanced and check what it's saying. It will normally, because the Pfsense firewall has a self-signed certificate, it will ask you whether you should accept the risk. So you can accept the risk and continue. So it will bring you to the screen and you would have to log into the appliance. So this is a Webconfigurator. So the default username is admin and the password is Pfsense, or in small caps. So you type that credentials and you can sign in for the first time. So when you sign in, you'd be given a screen like this. So it will tell you, welcome to Pfsense software. This is the wizard, configuration wizard. So you click on next, and yes, you click on next again. And in here, it will ask you the host name. So however you want to have this firewall, the name for this firewall. So let's say maybe Pfsense home lab or firewall home lab. Okay, let's do home lab -firewall in the domain. You can leave it as default, or if you have a specific domain, and if you have a primary DNS server, you can enter that, or you can leave it as default, and then you choose next. The next thing is the time server. You can leave it as Pfsense time server, or you can change it to maybe Google's time server or any other time server you want to use, and you can click on next. So in here, it will ask the WAN interface. This is for the WAN interface, so it's DHCP configured. You can change it to static if you'd want to, but I would like to leave it as DHCP. So you scroll down and you choose next. And in here, you can change the LAN IP address. So this is the IP address that we use to log into this firewall. You can change it to whatever IP address you want, but make sure you remember the IP address you're changing it to, because it will log you out and it will expect you to log back in to the firewall using that new IP address. So you click on next and you continue. So in here, you have to set a password, and so you can set any password you want. And so let's set a new password. And because this is a virtual environment, you can just set a simple password, because you will not use it in a real life setting. But in a real life setting, make sure to set a password which is complex and difficult to guess. So once you're done, you choose reload and it should effect all changes. It says that congratulations, Pfsense is now configured. Yes, so let's quickly look at all the, choose finish, and then let's quickly look at how the firewall looks. Let's look at the setup. Okay, so it will bring the licensing agreement you can accept, and you can close that. So this is how the Pfsense screen looks. So you have system information. It's customizable. You can change how the outlook of, or the layout of this Pfsense dashboard looks. Let's quickly look at the tabs. So we have system, so we can set certificates, self-signed. You can import certificates. You can go to the setup wizard. User manager will help you to add additional users. And my recommendation is always to disable the default admin and then set a new admin using your own username so that it cannot easily be guessed. That's if you're using the appliance in a real life setting. But in a virtual environment, you can just leave it as it is. So the other tab we have is assignments. So you can assign other interfaces like a VLAN or optional interfaces. So firewall, you can assign firewall rules. We'll learn more about that in subsequent videos. And we have all kinds of services. We have DHCP relay, where if you have several subnets and you want a DHCP to be used by a different subnet, you can do that. So there are several things you can do with the Pfsense firewall. We have IPsec VPN, L2TP, we have OpenVPN, we have the status, so we have failover, we have all these different options here, and diagnostics, so you have an app table, you have trace routes, several different things you can reboot here. So this is how the Pfsense firewall looks. It will help you to learn how to administer firewalls and manage networks and PCs. So it's a very useful firewall to have. The last thing we'll do is to log out. But even before we log out, when you log in, the Pfsense firewall logs it. It has a log. So in here, you see that it's saying that successful login for user admin from 192.168.1.100. So when we log out, I'm sure you'd also have that being logged in here. So let's log out. So it's a very simple way to log out. You just click the button on the right side of your screen and you can log out. So from here, you can power down your virtual machine, both your firewall and your Ubuntu or Windows virtual machine.